Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk about part two of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. In particular, we're going to talk about his attempt at arriving at moral perfection. And I'm going to argue there is something very American about this attempt, something American about Franklin's approach to moral perfection. Now, I told you before, there was a long gap between Franklin writing part one and part two. He wrote part one in 1771, but he doesn't write part two until 1784, 13 years later. And it appears one of the things that inspired him to start writing in was two letters he received from two gentlemen he didn't know. A man by the name of Abel James and another one by the name of Benjamin Vaughan. And out of the blue, they both wrote him. They had both read a copy of part one and were really impressed with it. But part one ends with Franklin in his early 20s, and he's in his late 70s at this point now, and they want him to continue writing his memoir. And they give him all kinds of justifications for doing so. If people in other countries get word of this, it will attract virtuous citizens. You should do it for American children who will be inspired by your life story. Make sure you tell your life story, because after you die, others are going to, and it would be good for you to get a record out there. And so part two always begins with copies of these letters from Benjamin Vaughan and Abel James. And it appears this is the thing that sparked Franklin to start writing again with this. Now, one of the things that's interesting about part two is there's something of a change in tone when Franklin gets to part two. And people have speculated that Franklin was very surprised how many people read part one. Remember, I told you Franklin never formally published any of this. He made some copies, gave it to family and friends, and other people made up copies. And it had a wider circulation than he was expecting. So when he sits down to write part two, well aware of how many people read part one, Franklin is more aware of an audience. He knows whether he publishes this or not, it's going to get into the hands of a fair number of people. And so people have talked about the change in tone in part two. One of the things you can kind of notice is Franklin is a bit more didactic. He's more straightforward teaching in this. Part one, he taught us through more storytelling. Now he's more explicitly telling us about his life. Now there's some charts and there's some graphs and there's some lists and there's a daily schedule. He's just more aware of a reader that's going to be there. All right. Now, part two is a very short little chapter. He begins it with actually a review of something he already talked about in part one. At the end of part one, he talks about his religious views. And we talked about his abandonment of deism and his embrace on the idea that the most important thing about religion is the morality that it inspires in the believer. And therefore, he was accepting of many religious faiths because he believed they often shared a similar morality. Franklin tells us about this at the end of part one. When he sat down to write part two 13 years later, he's now in Paris. He's in France, and he didn't have a copy of the autobiography with him. And so he sort of remembers where he left off, but he doesn't exactly remember what he talked about. And so one of the things that's interesting is you begin reading part two, and Franklin starts telling us all over about his religious views, as if we don't know anything about it. Franklin also created a club called the Junto. And he tells us about the Junto at the beginning of part two, as if we'd never heard about it before. He forgot he wrote about it at the end of part one, right? So if that seemed a little strange to you, that's the circumstances. If you're reading the end of part one and the beginning of part two in close proximity to each other, it reads sort of strange. Like, why is this guy telling me about this again as if he doesn't think I know about this? He already told me about this. Well, he just didn't remember. What were you doing 13 years ago? It's hard to remember such things. And so he tells us about it. Where things get really interesting for us is where he talks about this idea that came to him in his early 20s. He owns his printing house. He's doing well for himself. And it starts to occur to him he wants to become a better person. He wants to work on being a better person. That's an impulse a lot of people have had. I suspect some of you have had this impulse. I've had this impulse. I'm going to try and be a better person. But Franklin goes all the way with it. So this quote is from page 63 in your book, and he begins by saying, "It was about this time I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. As I knew, or thought I knew, what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other." Let's go back and kind of unpack this. All right. So it was about this time I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. All right, well, he says moral perfection, but he doesn't really mean moral perfection, right? He's just basically saying, I wanted to become a better person. Nobody can become morally perfect, right? Well, then he continues, "I wish to live without committing any fault at any time." Oh, okay. No, he is being very serious. When he says moral perfection, he really means moral perfection. No joke. "I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into." Interesting. Franklin is telling us that when we fall into bad behavior, it's sometimes for different reasons. Sometimes it's natural inclination. Some of us have weaknesses that others don't. Some people have problems with gambling. Other people, gambling's not a problem at all. Some people have problems with alcohol. Other people can consume alcohol their whole life and they don't develop a problem with it. We all have natural inclinations, and some things are more challenging for us. Franklin says, if I have a natural inclination, I will break that. Custom. Sometimes the society, the culture that you come from allows a certain degree of bad behavior, overlooks it. It's bad, but where you're from, it's customary, and you can get away with it. He's going to break that, even if there were things in, early colonial Philadelphia that were accepted bad behavior. He wasn't going to do it. Or company might lead me into. Sometimes your big problem with doing right and avoiding wrong is you're hanging out with the wrong people. Your friends are getting you in trouble. And Franklin says, I will conquer that too. Wherever my wrongdoing comes from, within me, from my culture, from my society, from the crew I'm hanging out with, I'm going to overcome it all. And then he continues, as I knew, or thought I knew, what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. It's interesting. Franklin in his early 20s seems to believe that the world was pretty black and white, that you basically always knew what the right thing to do was and what the wrong thing to do was. Now, mind you, Franklin is in his late 70s describing what he did and what he felt more than 50 years earlier in his life. Right? And so that's why he says, as I knew, comma, or thought I knew. In other words, old man Benjamin Franklin knows that, you know what, the world really isn't black and white. Sometimes there are gray areas. Sometimes despite the best of your wishes, you don't know what the right thing to do is. You don't know how to avoid that wrong choice. The older you get, the more you tend to learn that life is trickier than you imagined when you were young. But when he was a young man, he thought morality was straightforward. He's like, don't give me that gray stuff. The world's black and white. When presented with a moral decision, young Benjamin Franklin was like, if there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer. We all know it. I am now going to, from this point on, I am going to choose the right answer and avoid the wrong one. That's it. Old man autobiographer knew things were more complicated. And so that's why he says, as I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong. I didn't see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. I teach Benjamin Franklin's autobiography in my American Studies 201, Introduction to American Studies. And in that class, we really emphasize Benjamin Franklin and the Enlightenment. And this is a classic example of Benjamin Franklin's tremendous faith in reason and the power of reason. Franklin just thinks the man's ability to reason, his ability to reason, can overwhelm his passions, so that for the rest of his life, he could choose the right thing to do and avoid the wrong. He could overcome that. Well, the problem Franklin realized was it was more complicated than that. He had certain bad habits that he had established over the course of his life. And even though he intended to do the right thing in all situations, he tells us he wound up messing up and falling into bad behavior because he had these bad ideas, these bad habits. And so what he decided was, after that point, he needed to get more rigorous in his approach to arriving at moral perfection. Surprise, surprise, it turns out moral perfection is difficult. And so, well, a very Benjamin Franklin kind of thing to do would be to hit the books and study this subject matter. And that's what he did. He decided, all right, if I'm going to arrive at moral perfection, I'm going to need to understand what I'm even talking about. What would it mean to arrive at moral perfection? And so he starts studying moral perfection. Right? And eventually he arrives with a list of 13 virtues. And if he could master these virtues, he could arrive at moral perfection. In your book, in just about every version of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography I've ever seen, it not only lists the 13 virtues, but Benjamin Franklin's way of charting his success. See, what he decided to do, as he decided to get more rigorous in his attempt at moral perfection, was to work on each one of his virtues for a 1-week period. And after that week of really working and focusing on that, he would chart every time he had a problem with that, so he could see if he could improve later on this. He would put a check mark. The chart has the days of the weeks, the first letter of the each one of the 13 virtues running north-south, and each day of the week in initials running east and west. And every day he would mess up at one of these, he'd put a little mark on there. And he would go through all 13 over 13 weeks, and then he would start back over again and continue to track his success. Hopefully there would be fewer and fewer marks as time went on, and then eventually there would be no marks at all. And then Benjamin Franklin would have arrived at moral perfection. All right. Let's take a look at his list of virtues, because this is where I argue that there's something very American about Franklin's list of virtues. He gave us a virtue for each one, a one-word virtue, And then after it, a little saying to help us remember it. Remember, Franklin was famous for his aphorisms. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. So he not only just gave us the virtue, he gives us a little way of remembering it, a little saying. All right. Franklin believed these virtues were in order by which you needed to master them. Okay, so first on his list was temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Okay. This is first on the list because, frankly, if you're drunk, it's hard to make good decisions. All right? If you are drunk, you are not going to be able to accomplish the next 12. So first things first, temperance. Franklin admits to us he didn't have too much of a problem with this. If you look at his chart in the autobiography, there's no check marks or there's no dots next to this one. This one he was pretty good with, but it still is one of the things you had to master to arrive at moral perfection. Number 2 on his list, silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Now this one he tells us he did have problems with, and you do see dots, marks in his chart to track his successes. Ben liked to talk. And I suspect the context for this was Ben was a business owner. People would come into his shop. He would strike up conversations with them. He would talk for too long. He liked to discuss things with people, and some of his work would slip. You know, he was engaging in trifling conversation. So this was something he needed to work on, and he admitted, I had a problem with this. Number 3, order. Let all things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. Franklin again tells us that he has a problem. He had a problem with this one. He said as a young man, he had a very sharp mind and had a very good sense of memory. So he could lay, for example, papers any old place, and then days later he could remember where they were because he had a sharp memory. But he admits, as an old man, as he was when he was writing the autobiography, his mind was not as sharp as it once was. And because he never really mastered an excellent sense of order, now he will lay papers someplace and then days later try to remember where those papers were, and he can't remember. So this was another one. You see some dots on his chart where he had trouble with it. 4, resolution. Resolve to perform what you ought, perform without fail what you resolve. If you're going to do something, if you say you're going to do something, do it. Number 5 and 6, we've already talked about these ones quite a bit. 5, frugality. Make no expense but to do good to others or yourself. For example, waste nothing. All right, we've talked about saving. Ben was big on saving. Number 6, industry. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary action. It's interesting. I think we can tell which of these Ben personally finds to be more important than the others. The ones where he's most dogmatic and most black and white, most categorical, you can kind of tell mean more to him. And others, their virtues, they're on his list, but he gives us a little more wiggle room there. Take number 1, for example, temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Okay, in that one, did he tell us to never have a drink of alcohol? No, he didn't tell us not to drink. He just drink not to elevation. Don't get high. Once you start feeling the alcohol, that's when you know you got to cut yourself off. That's when you know you've had enough fun. You want to have a drink and you can be reasonable and it doesn't really affect you? Ben's saying, go ahead. Go ahead. You're all right. He gives us some wiggle room on that. He's going to give us wiggle room on number 7. I'll talk about that in a second. But look at industry. We talked about Ben thought hard work was so important for us. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary action. And he gives us no wiggle room on that one at all. So you can kind of tell that that's an important one. Same thing with frugality. Yeah. Now, number 7 is interesting because he does give us some wiggle room. Sincerity. Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly. Did Ben tell us to never tell a lie? Actually, no, he doesn't, does he? He tells us to be sincere. Use no hurtful deceit. It's interesting. He qualifies deceit. He could have just said, use no deceit. But he doesn't. He says, use no hurtful deceit. He gives us some wiggle room. Benjamin Franklin is straight up giving us the green light to lie. Why? Well, because it's hard not to tell little white lies. You know, your friend gets a bad haircut. It's obvious your friend got a haircut. Maybe they're not the kind of friend that likes to hear bad things and truthful things. You know, some of our friends we could straight up tell, like, oh, that's a bad haircut. Have a laugh about it. But you know, you got some friends. You better not say that to them. So you see them and they got a haircut and you feel like you have to say something. You go, oh, I like your haircut. That's a little white lie, right? Sometimes these little white lies are the grease that allows society to continue functioning. Because the day we all start telling each other the truth in all situations might be the day that civilization comes to an end. So Franklin doesn't tell us categorically never to lie. He's saying don't use any hurtful deceit. Okay? The reason I'm lying about my friend's haircut is precisely because I don't want to hurt my friend. The truth in that situation is hurtful, and therefore to not be hurtful, I'm going to lie and tell them that they got a nice haircut. By the way, with this description and all the others, I am not saying Benjamin Franklin is right about this. Okay? You don't have to believe anything Franklin's saying. I'm not saying he's correct. Maybe you're the kind of person that, like, I try to really avoid lying in all situations when I can, and that's how I roll. You know, a friend gets a bad haircut, I tell them they got a bad haircut. And if they don't like it, well, they're not going to be my friends anymore. All right, so I'm not saying Franklin's right about this. This is just Franklin's attitude and his views. You don't have to buy into any of them, but that's his belief. All right. Number 8, justice. Wrong none by doing injuries or admitting the benefits that are your duty. Yeah, pretty straightforward. Number 9, moderation. Avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Forbear, put up with. Put up with, right? Moderation is sometimes called the golden mean. It's the most important. Aristotle believed that moderation was the most important of all virtues, because if you master moderation, it takes care of most other problems. Like, take for instance, if you really mastered moderation, do we really need number 1 and temperance? Maybe not. Maybe not, because if you are being moderate, you are not eating to dullness. You are not drinking to elevation. But nonetheless, just to cover all his bases, Franklin throws in moderation there. Now, 10 is interesting. And 10 is where we start. This is where I believe Benjamin Franklin gives the game away. And this is where we start to see this American dimension that I want to argue Franklin's 13 virtues seems to represent. Cleanliness. Tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Okay? Good advice. You know, I wake up every day, I take a shower, slap some deodorant on, brush my teeth, you know, run a comb through my hair, put on clean clothing. That's, you know, I got no problem with this in Franklin encouraging us to be clean. But is it a moral virtue? Remember, that's what this is supposed to be. His virtues are supposed to be about arriving at moral perfection. Is cleanliness really about morality? Let's put it this way. How bad does a person have to smell for it to become a moral issue, right? Somebody comes into a room you're in with really bad BO, and it's painful for you. Okay, maybe we're now getting to a moral issue. But at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to think about all the things that are not on this list of virtues. And yet cleanliness is. What I'll argue, we'll go through the rest of these. But what I would argue here is that Franklin's list of virtues is not really a list of universal virtues for all people throughout human history. This is an American list of virtues. This is a list of virtues for the self-made man. Or we can update it to our age, the self-made person, man or woman. That Franklin has narrowed in on virtues that are particularly useful for a person to become successful, to become wealthy, to impress other people, to ingratiate yourself with other people. Don't get drunk. Don't shoot your mouth off. Right? Only speak when you should speak. A lot of people run into trouble when they talk too much. I tell my own kids sometimes, hey man, don't talk so much when you're around other people sometimes. Right? Instead of talking, listen. Right? You're going to get yourself into trouble by talking too much sometimes. Order. Keep things in their places. Save money. Work hard. Be sincere. Tell the truth, but don't tell too much of the truth. If your powerful boss gets a bad haircut, don't walk around going, hey boss, that's a really bad haircut. And next thing you know, you're getting fired. Don't be too honest if you're a salesperson and you know there's a competitor that has another product that's actually better than your product, but you're not a salesman for that company. You're not a salesperson for that company. And so therefore, you don't talk about that other product. You talk about your product. Go ahead and be truthful, but don't necessarily be truthful all the time. This is one of the reasons why that wiggle room there is really important. Justice, moderation, cleanliness. I don't know if cleanliness is a moral virtue. In fact, I suspect some of the greatest, most moral people that have ever lived have been quite smelly and dirty. It's one of the reasons they didn't care about such worldly things. But I can tell you that cleanliness is pretty important if you want to succeed in life. If you want to ingratiate yourself to powerful people, if you want to get a good job, you walk into a job interview and you funk up the whole place with your BO, guess what? You're not getting that job. So I don't know if cleanliness is a moral virtue, but I do know it's an important element in success for most people in most occupations. That's why it's on the list. That's why I say, this is the point where Franklin gives it up. This is a list of virtues for somebody to be moral perfect that wants to be like Benjamin Franklin. For the self-made person. All right, let's continue. 11. Tranquility. Be not disturbed at trifles or accidents common or unavoidable. Kind of similar to moderation there. Number 12, chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. This one falls under the category of do as I say, not as I do. Because as we know, Benjamin Franklin stepped out on his wife. Oh, that reminds me, I haven't talked about his wife. We'll talk about that after I'm done with this. Rarely use venery. Venery is a very old-timey word for sex. So rarely use sex, but for health or offspring. Health, there's something always strikes me as very modern about Franklin talking about having sex for health, as if sex is a healthy part of a life. Sounds quite modern there, all right? And then finally, I told you that Franklin tells us that his list of virtues were in order by which you needed to accomplish them. So first things first, maintain your sobriety, because if you're getting drunk, you're going to have a hard time with the next 12. Well, the last virtue you needed to master was humility. Humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. If you arrive at moral perfection, one of your last stumbling blocks would be to walk around and brag about how you are morally perfect. Hey everybody, look at me, I'm morally perfect. Right? And suddenly you're not morally perfect because you're walking around bragging about how great you are. So this would be the last obstacle. There might be a temptation to brag about yourself with this. So maintain your humility. Jesus, if Christians are right about things, was the Son of God who allowed himself to be killed for the sins of mankind. That sounds like a pretty humble act. Socrates, Franklin, earlier in the autobiography in part 1, talks about the Socratic method, which is a method of reasoning, sort of debating with people by repeatedly asking that person questions. You just question them. And when they give you answers, you question their answers to get them to reconsider their position. Your questions are supposed to point out the poor logic or the fallacy of their position. It comes from the Greek philosopher Socrates. Socrates believed that the biggest obstacle in people attaining wisdom was that they already thought they had all the answers. And if you think you have all the answers, then you are not receptive to learn new things. If you have ever been in a car with someone who is lost, they're driving, you're a passenger, they're lost, and you know you're lost, and you're pleading with them to pull over and ask somebody for directions, or ask the person in the next car for directions, and they refuse to do so, you understand what Socrates was talking about. The problem with this person driving is they think they have all the answers, but they don't. But if they just admitted their ignorance, if they admitted, I don't know this thing. To Socrates, that was the most important step. Once a person admitted they didn't know something, then they can learn. That's the big obstacle. So Socrates, as his teacher, didn't lecture. He would ask his students questions. He would ask his students questions, and they would give him answers. And then he would ask more questions, pointing out the deficiency of their answer, and it would force the student to give better and better answers until you finally got an answer that was bulletproof and impenetrable and could not be refuted by more questioning. And so that's the Socratic method, the repeated use of questions to elicit better and better answers. Franklin talked about liking the Socratic method. In fact, remember when we talked about Franklin going around the streets of Boston and having people question their views on religion? He was using the Socratic method as he was doing things. When he was a deist, he was asking the vast majority of these Christian people to reconsider their views on religion, and that's one of the reasons he had to leave Boston. He was using the Socratic method to get people to be deists by asking them pointed questions about their Christianity. Well, Socrates was famously humble because he always said, I know nothing. I don't know anything. That's why I'm asking questions. I ask questions because I want to learn. So both Jesus and Socrates were famously humble. All right. So humility is the last of our list. Now, one of the things you could be struck by is the limited nature of this list. Only 13 virtues. Whenever I teach this class on campus, I make a joke to my students in the room. I said, if I offered each of you $5 for every virtue you can think of, we would do nothing the rest of the semester but just listen to you guys come up with various virtues to pull $5 from me on each one of those. That is something of an exaggeration, but trust me, there are a lot of other virtues that could be put on there. Now, in fairness to Franklin, Franklin would tell us, come on, guys, give me a break. I'm trying to come up with something usable. If I came up with a list of 500 or 1,000 virtues, it would be so unwieldy, so difficult to master. I'd never get anything done. So I needed to come up with an idea of moral virtues that was limited enough to be mastered. And I think we could acknowledge that there's some fairness to that. I think he's right. Despite the fact I think there are a lot more virtues than he lists on here, I get the reason why he's trying to keep it to a limited number there. That makes sense. But it still begs the question, why these? Why only these ones? Your discussion question for this week is about what virtue would you put on this list? Take one of them off, and what would you replace it with? What virtue is missing? What do you personally think is missing from Franklin's list of virtues here? And I've asked this question before of students, and if your class is like most classes, I'm going to get a tremendous variety of answers here. Where's love? Where's courage? Where's loyalty? Where's any other? Where's selflessness on this list? I don't see them here. And what's interesting is a lot of the virtues that students come up with, not all of them, but they often reflect acts that do not neatly translate into achieving success in life. Think of courage. In certain contexts, courage can make you wealthy, but courage can also get you killed. Okay. Sacrifice. A lot of rich, famous, powerful people are rich, powerful, and famous precisely because they didn't sacrifice for other people. They were very self-motivated. They were focused on me, and they pursued their self-interest beyond whatever else was good to those people in their life. Not everybody, but a lot of times when you look at the profile of very successful, very rich people. A lot of the things that we might put on this list do not neatly translate into things that will help you achieve success in life. Love is a wonderful thing, but love cannot be monetized. In fact, if you're going to work a 60, 70-hour work week, if you're going to be single-mindedly pursuing success in life, being too hung up on a girlfriend, a wife, a children, demands of a family is going to get in the way of that. It's going to get in the way of that. So it's not on Franklin's list. This list of virtues is a list of virtues that fits very neatly with a sense of American self-made man, self-made person now in our modern context. It fits neatly with that. This is a list of virtues for a person trying to rise. Okay? Not for any old person. This is an American list of virtues. At least that's what I would argue. All right, and then let's take a look at Franklin's daily schedule here. Not only did Franklin track his achievement. Let me get back to a couple things. I told you I was going to talk about. Let's go. Franklin never actually arrived at moral perfection, it turns out. He admits to us, after telling us all about the 13 virtues, he said it was a worthwhile endeavor and that he definitely became a better person, and it was he was better for the effort, but alas, he did not arrive at moral perfection. All right, so he admits it. But he still tells us about it because he thinks it's a good list and that we could learn some things of it. I also told you we never talked about Benjamin Franklin's wife. It's an interesting story. when Franklin started courting his wife just before he went to England, and they were quite serious. But remember, he stays in England longer than he expected. Um, and while he was there, he didn't write to her as much as he should have. In fact, he admits he sort of stopped his correspondence. And when he gets back, she's married another man because she had stopped hearing from him. He was across the Atlantic. She didn't know what was going on with him, so she married another man. And once again, just like with admitting his responsibility for getting stranded in England, he also admits it was 100% his fault and he didn't blame her. He had cut off correspondence and she married another man, and it was his fault. But it turns out that Deborah Reed's new husband was not a very good man and eventually abandons her. It was speculated he went to sea and actually died while at sea, but there was no official recording of his death. After her husband abandons her, Franklin and Miss Reed start a courtship once again. But here was the problem. Technically, she was still married as far as the colony of Pennsylvania was concerned. And if she married Benjamin Franklin and her husband ever came back in a year, 10 years, 50 years, Franklin and Deborah Reed would be polygamists. And that was a serious crime back in these days. And so, since they couldn't risk getting formally married, what they did was they just moved in with one another. They just started living together. He called her wife, and she called him husband. And because divorce was difficult to get, and abandonment was more common in those days, particularly men abandoning women, the community in Philadelphia understood the situation, that here was a woman that had been abandoned by her husband, and here's another man that wants to have a life with her and provide for her. And rather than her being a burden on the community, let's let that man take care of her. And they can't technically get married, and we understand that, but she's going to call him husband and he's going to call her wife, and we'll basically treat him like that. That's what they did. So strictly speaking, Benjamin Franklin was never married. Okay. However, it's because of this technical reason. He would have married her. They would have been married if it was legally possible. But they weren't. So I told you before I was going to tell you about that, and I never paid that off. So good to do that here. All right, let's take a look at Franklin's daily schedule here. Okay, so this is always reprinted with versions of the autobiography also. So he wakes up in the morning and he starts with his question of the day. All right. What good shall I do this day? And then this was his morning schedule: rise, wash, address powerful goodness. I'll get back to that. Contrive day's business, and take the resolution of the day. Prosecute the present study, and breakfast. So those are all the things he does before going off to work. Most of those are straightforward. Rise, we get them. Wash, okay, I understand. Address powerful goodness. You know what that means? Pray. He'd pray in the morning. But Ben, always seeming to go out of his way to be unconventional with his religious views, doesn't want to just say, rise, wash, pray. Instead, he says, address powerful goodness, which is his way of saying praying. But it's not just weird that he's avoiding the word pray. That's weird enough. But look at what he's, address powerful goodness. Address. It's weird. You know, let's face it, in these lectures we're having right now, I'm addressing you because I'm the one that's paid to be the teacher here. I'm the one that's going to give you a grade, right? I'm not watching lectures you're giving. You're watching my lectures, right? And so I'm addressing you. Usually when we hear one person addressing another, not just talking, not conversing, but one person addressing another, there's almost implied a kind of power dynamic in that the person doing the addressing is the important one, and the person being addressed is the less powerful one. But here Franklin's inverting that. Franklin is addressing God. It's such a weird way to talk about that. It's not just weird he's just doesn't want to say prayer, but he's saying he's addressing God. Hey God, you paying attention up there? I got some things to tell you. It's so weird. Right? But nonetheless, that's what he says. Right? Contrive the day's business. Take the resolution of the day is, what good shall I do this day? Prosecutes, he'd do some studying before work and have some breakfast. Then he would get to work at 8 o'clock, knock off for lunch at noon, have a nice 2-hour lunch break where he would read, look over his accounts, and dine. Notice he was studying before work. He's studying some on his lunch break. Gets done with work at 5 o'clock. Actually 6 o'clock. Then for the rest of the evening, put things in their places: supper, music, or diversion, or conversation, and then the examination of the day, what he was studying. And he would ask himself an evening question: what good have I done today? I always suspect that's in case he hadn't done his earlier resolution of the day, what good shall I do? There's still a little time left where he could, maybe go find a cat that was stuck in a tree and help bring it down or something like that. And then he would go to sleep. This was Benjamin Franklin's daily schedule, and people have emulated Franklin's daily schedule literally for centuries to try and emulate Franklin's success. Now, one person who did not care for Benjamin Franklin was the writer Mark Twain. And this is where we're going to end our unit on Benjamin Franklin. Twain had a similar background to Franklin in one sense, that both men had an older brother that was a printer that they went to work with. The only difference was Twain not only hated printing, but his older brother force-fed him a heavy diet of Benjamin Franklin. I've included with this week a short little, and it's really short, essay that Mark Twain wrote satirizing Benjamin Franklin and his virtues. And it's funny and it's over the top, but within that there belies some hostility. Twain was the author of Huckleberry Finn, and one way to think about the difference between Mark Twain and Benjamin Franklin is to think of the character of Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn is almost the opposite of young Benjamin Franklin. Franklin would study and work hard and disciplined and wanted to improve and did well in school. Huck Finn, he wanted to run away from teachers and did run away from school and from parents and from responsibility and hard work and wanted to lounge and wanted to relax. And what's so interesting about this dichotomy is that both Twain and Franklin have been viewed as so quintessentially American, both in their personal traits and also the nature of their writing. Ernest Hemingway once wrote that all modern American literature stems from Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn. And yet these two were in contrast with one another. So, this whole work, stay up by candlelight, study your math. Twain makes a crack about his parents would force him to wake up before 9 o'clock and in the morning, as if 9 o'clock is really early. And if they had just let him have his natural rest, he would have had a more successful life. He would have been a respectable shopkeeper, but instead he's the degenerate that he was. Twain is having fun, and it's satire. But beneath that satire is a kind of biting criticism about the expectation that we all should be like Benjamin Franklin. In fact, towards the end of his tiny little essay, he says that Franklin's eccentricities were not what caused him to be successful. Rather, he was a genius, and often geniuses have weird ideas. But instead, we are given Franklin, particularly in the form of the autobiography, as if here's a blueprint we're all supposed to copy. And if we copy that, we will be like Benjamin Franklin. But Twain says, no, we're not going to be him, because he was a genius. And his weird ideas weren't what made him a genius. He was a genius, so therefore he had weird ideas. Right? And the idea we should be copying him is a bad idea. I think that's an interesting place to leave this off and for us to ponder as we will now start dealing with some other people to help us better understand aspects of American character. Okay, long lecture this time, but there's no good place to break this up into 2 lectures. So I just made it one long lecture. All right, everybody. I'll see you next time. Bye.